Okay, well, good morning, Josh. How are you doing today?
Good. How's it going?
Good, good. Thanks for joining me today and answering those questions all FBA sellers wonder about, especially Canadians. Well, first of all, I guess, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your firm?
Sure. We're LiveCA LLP. We're an online accounting firm. We'd be the largest online accounting firm in Canada. We're about just about 50 people almost. Everyone works remotely across the different provinces. And we work with a lot of businesses that you can imagine work in the tech space. It could be large tech companies like a company like Simple. It can also be lots of, in this case, Amazon sellers or people that get this online environment.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Cool. Okay, so let's get right in the questions that I asked my subscribers. So the first one would be, as a Canadian selling on Amazon.com, should you incorporate right from the start?
Uh, so one thing has nothing to do with the other, meaning just because you're selling on Amazon.com doesn't mean you should incorporate. Incorporation is a separate question, and that has to do with how much you're earning, how much you plan to earn, perhaps liability concerns. I'm sure we'll get into it eventually, but incorporating, if you're asking about Amazon.com specifically as it relates to, let's say, EIN, incorporation, let's just call it, is not a necessity.
Okay, awesome. And let's say one gets to a point where they should incorporate. Would you recommend a provincial or a federal corporation or even like a US LLC? Because we hear different things from different people. So
Sure. So I'll say a lot of these questions are loaded questions because in many, many cases, you'll say it depends. And that's why, while I'll give you answers for these questions, keep in mind that the answers will be general in nature.
yeah,
Whether you incorporate provincially or federally has to do with a number of different aspects. A lot of it legal as to where you want name protection, et cetera. Almost a separate question. Doesn't really have to do with this sort of Amazon concept. A US LLC, before you go and open a US anything, right, I would strongly suggest you consider all your options. And if you're Canadian and you're in Canada for more than 6 months a year, the Canadian government, no matter what you open in the US, has the right to say, hey, I don't care if you have a US LLC, we're going to tax you in Canada. And so, again, we'll get to the AIN part, but it's more than likely that you'll open a corporation in Canada.
okay, awesome. Yeah, well, I was also wondering because some people say, if they sell on Amazon.com or they sell in the US via Shopify, and then they also sell in Canada via Shopify or even on Amazon.ca, right? So if you sell in both, then, one might be better than the other.
Yeah, I'll just make another comment there. In general, a corporation, a Canadian corporation, can have sales across the world,
Yeah,
right? So just because you have customers in Europe doesn't mean you have to open a European corporation.
yeah.
If I'm a consultant and I'm doing web development for someone in India, it doesn't mean I have to have an Indian corporation.
Mhm.
That's no different for an Amazon seller conceptually.
Okay, awesome. Um, okay, and then another question that someone sent me was, if you were to open a US LLC, are there any states you'd recommend or?
Uh, I don't love that question because it suggests that opening a US LLC is a good idea. I
Yeah,
don't think it is in many cases.
okay, okay,
And if we're talking about Canadians,
yeah,
right? If we're talking about Canadians in Canada for more than 6 months a year, I don't think it's a great idea.
okay,
And so, and to get to your question about the state, perhaps we'll get to it, but generally speaking, it's more related to sales tax, and it has to do with where your customer base is stronger.
okay,
Perhaps we'll get to that.
okay, cool. Um, okay, well, regarding the EIN, so should you get an EIN right from the start? And like, what are the implications of that? Let's say you were to sell as under your personal name or even as a corporation based out of Canada.
Let's start with what an EIN means,
Yes.
right? The implications of an EIN is you all of a sudden are required to do some sort of US compliance. The most standard form of US compliance is what's called 1120F. 1120F is a US tax form that tells the US government, hey, I have a presence in the US, but I don't have an office there. I don't have a nexus there. And I'm filing taxes in Canada. I'm using the tax treaty. That's the concept of the 1120F. You have to do that once you have an EIN. You typically want to get an accountant involved at that stage. Do you need an EIN? You don't need an EIN unless a vendor is telling you you have to have an EIN, right? So I would not get it straight from the start. I'd wait and see, because and Amazon can change from time to time in terms of their requirements. So I wait and see if you're required to get one.
Okay, awesome. And then that brings me to sales taxes in the US. That's probably the question I get the most often. How does it work? Because, you know, some states have different definitions of what nexus status is. And everyone is wondering, should we collect sales taxes in the US? In certain states, in all states, in no states? What's your take on that?
If you're looking for a yes or no answer, you're not going to get one. So the way to look at this question is the spectrum of risk and exposure.
Okay.
So very recently, the US government has launched a program of voluntary disclosure to say, hey, Amazon sellers, you should be filing sales tax in different states. Let's think about for a second what that actually means, okay? If you were a brick and mortar store, you were in various states, what that would mean is setting up shop in that particular state and charging sales tax to your customers in that state. Think about US sales tax. Whereas in Canada, there's just a few different rates for different provinces. US, it depends by municipality. There are thousands and thousands of rates. Right? It's so complex that you need special tax software to deal with US sales tax. So if you were a brick and mortar, you would charge sales tax at the rate wherever that tax jurisdiction you're in would be. If you had customers in multiple jurisdictions in different places in California, for example, you'd have to know where your customers are and charge them the right sales tax rate. So let's think about what this means then for an Amazon seller. It means that you have to know exactly where your inventory is at all time. Sure, you can register in those states. You probably don't know where your inventory is. You have to figure out where all your customers are. Customers might be at every single state. If you wanted to do this by the book, it would probably mean registering for sales tax in that state, collecting the various tax rates from whatever tax jurisdiction your customer is in, filing a US state tax return, recording your sales there, and then recording a federal return. You might pay, if you think about this, to do, 20 to 30 state tax returns and a US federal corporation, US federal return for a Canadian corporation. You're basically operating like at a multinational corporation at that point. You will pay very, very high accounting fees if you want to do that. Like 20, 30, 40 grand of accounting fees just to do your compliance, if that's what you wanted to do. So that's why I take this question and say, not what should you do, but what's your exposure if you don't do that? So if you're an Amazon seller and you're selling $30,000 a year and you've got $100 in California, should you register in California? Up to you. What's your exposure if you don't? Well, how much California tax should you have collected? $2. What's your exposure? $2 plus interest and penalties, perhaps, right? And I know there's different states have different penalties, but that's the concept. So to me, the way you answer this question is you look at what's the exposure if I don't file, right? And if I don't register, and sort of what's the gain by registering? And hey, if you're a multi-million-dollar Amazon seller, you should probably take this question a lot more seriously, because hey, what maybe $30,000 to $40,000 in accounting fees if you're multi-million dollars is okay. It's the cost of doing business.
Exactly.
Making 100 grand, you probably don't want to spend half of your money on accounting fees.
Okay, I hear you. Because basically, let's say you were only selling on Amazon and you use FBA, theoretically, because Amazon transfer your inventory to all the different warehouses, right? So for us, we could get a report and see exactly which warehouses we have inventory in, and most likely it's in, like you said, probably 30 different states, right?
That's right.
Okay, cool. Now, we often hear about, there's a treaty between Canada and the US. So, well, I guess you already answered this in a way. Do we have to report ourselves to the IRS? And if we do we report $0 in sales? But I guess that's a matter if you have an EIN or not.
It really depends what kind of entity you have. But yeah, like if you have a Canadian corporation and you have an EIN, which is a very common structure from an Amazon.com seller,
Yeah.
which means you don't have an official US entity, then in this case, you actually fill out, for the most part, your 1120F is going to be blank. And you're claiming what's called treaty benefits. You're saying, hey, don't worry, I'm reporting my income in Canada. So under that, at least as of today anyway, it's not typical to report anything to the IRS beyond that 1120F.
Okay.
If for whatever reason you went that sales tax registration route and all of a sudden you want to report US sales tax in various states and you have to do a state tax return, well, that's a different story. You probably have to then start reporting your sales.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Total sense. Okay, cool. Now, when selling in other countries such as UK, for example, because I'm just wondering, because I know a few different sellers who sell in the UK market.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, one of them actually opened a corporation there. And the other one is selling from his corporation here based in Alberta. But he says if it was to start over, he would probably start a corporation there because it's so much trouble dealing with taxes. So what would be your advice on that?
Again, going back to this whole concept of it depends, right? It depends on the level of sales. It depends on where the majority of your customers are. My feeling, and this is my personal opinion, is that business should come first and taxes should come after. Meaning decide where your market is first, decide if it's a successful market, and then figure out, okay, what should I be doing for taxes if that's the case? So for example, if you're just starting to sell in the UK and you don't know what your sales are going to be like in the UK, should you set up a corporation? Do you want to go through the hassle and then only to find out 6 months later that it wasn't really the market, right? So I'd say if after a few months you're like, I've got lots of UK sales all of a sudden, right? Now I want to talk to somebody to find out, should I be collecting VAT? Should I have an entity there? Should I have transfer pricing between Canada and UK? So that you end up adding layers. So I guess in short, every time you open another entity in another country, you're increasing your tax compliance, you're increasing your costs, you're increasing your complexity. And so you should always think about cost benefit. Is it worth it to do that because of that good market's going to be successful and because that's what I have to do about the cost of doing business? Yeah. Or should I keep the status quo because I'm not there yet in my business?
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. Awesome. Okay, and then when selling on Amazon.ca or in Canada in general, a lot of people say, they ask, is it true that until you do like $30,000 Canadian in sales as an individual, you don't have to, until you hit that, you don't have to collect sales tax?
That's right. Yeah, for the most part, there's exceptions, but for the most part, if you're under 30 grand in a calendar year, you don't have to collect GST. You don't have to register for GST.
Okay, awesome. And then, so once you do, let's say you sell as an individual and then you start doing over $30,000 in sales, then what? Then you should just register for GST, or you probably have to register for every province, right? Like HST. No?
GST, HST is federal tax, meaning it's just one business number. You can do it online, business number registration online. Or you can call the CRA 1-800-959-5525. You hit star, you ask them you want to register for GST, HST number. That's it. So it's actually that simple. If you're getting into PST, and that's what you're asking, then that depends on the province. And then actually each province has their own specific rules. Those provinces that have PST or RST, retail sales tax, specific rules around what kind of products are PST or RST applicable.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, well, yeah, this you already answered. Now this one, that's someone sent me this question yesterday, and it is, well, I guess that's very dependent on the person or the case, but he says, what do you do to save the most money from the government? How much to pay yourself to be in the lowest tax bracket? I guess that's more of an individual question, but
how much to pay yourself to be in the lower, say, I mean, you can look up the lowest tax brackets online. I mean, the lowest tax bracket is 0. I mean, you can earn up to whatever it is, but the personal exemption level, which is, it changes every year, but about $13,000-14,000. And if you pay yourself that amount, then you suppose you don't really pay any tax. You might pay some CPP. But most people can't live on $14,000.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. This one. Okay, so this guy had 3 questions. This one you kind of already answered also. At what point does it become a net benefit to incorporate, and what advantage, if any, is there to incorporating federally or provincially? That we already answered. And once you're incorporated, how does the federal small business tax credit for Canadian-controlled private corporations work? He says, I hear it offers a substantial tax advantage over filing personally as a sole proprietor for companies with revenue of less than $500,000 Canadian. And how does it influence the decision of when to incorporate?
That's the question of like, when do I incorporate? So that's more of a question that says, how does incorporation work? I'll do like a very quick answer. The small business tax rate, more or less, right, when you take it sort of the combined rates, it's about 15% on average, depending on the province. They're talking about lowering it, but that's it. So if you earn $100,000, let's say, in your business, then you'll pay $15,000 of corporate tax. Now, if you take that money out, let's say you only take out a small amount, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000 in the form of a dividend, you might pay 0 personal tax, right? Whereas had you earned $100,000 as a sole proprietor, you'll probably pay about 30 grand of tax. Yeah. So it makes sense in that case, if you don't need very much money and you're earning more than you need to live, it makes sense to incorporate.
Okay, awesome. And then he said, I also hear that to qualify for an Amazon professional seller account, you are required to provide Amazon with an EIN. For new sellers who are considering starting off with a pro seller account, it would be useful to be aware of any direct or indirect costs or disadvantages of acquiring an EIN right away. Well, that you already answered. There's implications and costs involved. It's just a matter of whether it's risk or not.
Right.
And then what is the process to declare income in Canada and only pay tax in Canada? You already answered. But then he asked, is WABEN sufficient to accomplish this? But from what you said, it's the 1120F form mainly? Okay, awesome. Well, I guess you already answered that. And then as a seller, that was another question. As a seller earning revenue in US dollars throughout the year, but you are being paid monthly, it's more semi-monthly or bi-weekly, from Amazon, and Forex rates are always changing. At what point should you be recognizing revenue and calculating the Forex gain and loss? Is it at the time of each sell, or can you calculate the Forex gain or loss based on a given period of when Amazon pays you?
Use accounting software is what I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're trying to calculate foreign gains or losses on Excel by yourself, then you're doing a lot of work. So let's just say that if you're selling a substantial amount, you should be using accounting software, which does that for you. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think that was it, Josh, honestly. I think I went through all the questions people had. So basically, kind of to wrap up, really whether you should incorporate or not, or federally, provincially, it's case by case, really.
Yeah, I mean, look, not to toot the order of accountants, but this is our job, right? Which is what I would say is when, just like any other professional, right? When your business gets to a point where you're earning more than you need to live, and it's a successful business, and this is not just a side project, but something you're going to do full time. Yeah, I'd suggest a conversation with an accountant, because it is very opinion based, right? It is very experience based. There are aspects of this that if you just looked up the rule, then like I talked about in sales tax, then you might end up over your head with costs. And so it's always good to bounce this idea off an accountant. And I'd say to actually use one if you're going to go again, if you have enough money there and it's a viable business, I would suggest using an accountant at that stage.
Yeah.
If not, you're sort of still sort of looking and seeing what resources are out there. I know that, for example, we on our blog have answers to a lot of these questions. So we've talked about, so LiveCA.ca and on the blog there, I've got answers to when you should incorporate and how you should compensate yourself and how you should handle U.S. filings, etc.
Okay, cool. So what I'll do is if you could send me the link to that, or I'll find it, I'll just put it in the description below. And then if people want to get in contact with you, I'll put your information as well, maybe for your website. And
that'd be great.
Yeah, and then that's pretty much it. So if you guys have been looking for CPAs who deal with e-commerce and online sales, and in the U.S. as well, well, Josh and his firm deal with that. So I'll put their info in the description below, and and hope you guys actually found some value out of this. So thanks for joining us, Josh, and answering our questions. And we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.